The Bible's New Testament begins with the book of Matthew. Like the three books after it, known as the Gospels, it tells of the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Written in the latter half of the first century, many scholars and historians believe it was written by Matthew, one of the disciples of Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector in the area of Capernaum for the occupying Roman authority. Bible teacher Michael Card takes us on a journey to Israel, the land of the Bible, to explore the life, times, and words of Matthew, words that prove the identity of Jesus Christ as Messiah, and what that means to those who choose to follow him.
As the 11th chapter of Matthew closes, Jesus had been reaching out, inviting his listeners to find Sabbath rest in him, to exchange the burdensome yoke of the Pharisees' old orthodoxy for the restful yoke of learning from him. Among the rising crowds following and listening to Jesus was a small cross-section of Pharisees, looking for him to make mistakes and trying to hold Jesus accountable to their interpretation of the law.
In Matthew 12, he returns to one of the themes he's interested in, and that's the fact that from the very beginning, Satan has tried to take Jesus' life. In chapter 12, we read of a plot. Only Matthew tells us of the slaughter of the innocents, that at one point they tried to kill Jesus by killing all the little boys in Bethlehem. There are several plots during the course of his ministry, and then right up until the cross, they try to poison Jesus with gall. Only Matthew tells us that. In response to this attempt to take his life, Matthew says that Jesus retreats into the wilderness. He's trying to get alone, but the crowds follow him. Matthew sees this all as a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy. That's how Matthew thinks. This time it's Isaiah 42, and the image is of a gentle servant. A gentle servant of God who accomplishes something through gentleness that all the wars in all of human history have not been able to accomplish. He can establish justice. Isaiah paints the picture of a gentle servant who doesn't argue. He doesn't even raise his voice. A bent reed that's not quite broken. He's so gentle he won't even break it. A smoldering wick, this fire's just about to go out. He's so gentle he won't even put out a smoldering wick. He is manifestly gentle, and yet through his gentleness, he's able to establish justice. And Isaiah saw this 600 years before Jesus was even born.
John the Baptist had been held in the Machaerus, one of Herod the Great's grim castle fortresses, on Antipas' orders. You can visit this site today in Jordan and get a feel for the isolation of this location. John had publicly denounced Herod Antipas' adulterous relationship with his brother Philip's wife, and for that Herodias influenced her husband to have John arrested.
Chapter 14 of Matthew introduces another solitary period, or a time when Jesus is trying to find solitude. He's trying to get away from the mob. He's trying to get away from his disciples, but he can't seem to. Matthew uses this as an occasion to tell about the ludicrous death of John the Baptist. It's told as a flashback. Matthew tells us that Herod had arrested John, had him held in prison. Josephus tells us it's the Machaerus prison. Matthew tells of the banquet. It's Herod's birthday. Very Gentile idea to celebrate your birthday. The Jews at this point didn't do that. And during the banquet, his stepdaughter provides some, let's say, questionable entertainment. And Herod, in his stupor, promises her anything she wants. Her mother has told her to ask for the head of John the Baptist because her mom, Herodias, absolutely hates John. And so his life is ended in a bizarre way. His head chopped off and given to a dancing girl. And Jesus goes into the wilderness to mourn his cousin, but I also wonder if he's beginning to think about what's waiting for him in Jerusalem in just a few weeks. The feeding of the 5,000 took place on a hillside very close to where we are now. But after the feeding is over, Jesus seems to be urgent in dismissing the crowd. He puts the disciples in a boat and sends them across the lake. I think he's still trying to get some solitary time so that he can talk with the Father. He goes up on the hillside to pray. Later in the evening, he looks out on the lake, and you can see from the size of the lake, if there's a boat on this lake, you can see it from the shoreline. He sees that the disciples are rowing against a contrary wind. This is not a storm like chapter 8. It's just a wind that's blowing against them, and they're not making very much headway. So late in the night, early in the evening, they see a figure coming towards them, walking on the water, and they think it's a ghost. Matthew uses the word phantasm. I mean, what else walks on the water at this time of the evening? But above the wind and the noise of the waves, they hear a familiar voice. It says, "It's me. I am," he says. At this point, Peter calls out to Jesus, "If it's you, then bid me to come to you, walking on the water." Peter understands that the initiative must come from Jesus. It can't be his idea. And Jesus simply says, "Come." Peter gets out, gets his balance, I guess, and then walks to Jesus on the water. But at some point, he realizes that he's defying gravity, which must be a pretty scary thing, and he starts to sink. And immediately Jesus is there, takes him by the hand. The two of them get back in the boat, and then the real miracle happens. I'm not saying walking on the water isn't a great miracle. But what happens in the Gospel of Matthew is the identity of Jesus becomes clear. In the first storm, they said, "Who is this man?" Now, after Jesus walks on the water, for the very first time in all of their time together, Matthew tells us the disciples worship Jesus because they know who he is. For the third time now in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is trying to get some solitude. He's trying to get away from the presence of the crowd. He goes all the way to Sidon, which is 50 or 60 miles away. Mark will tell us he's actually hiding up there. He's trying to keep his presence a secret. There he meets a woman, a Gentile woman, who Matthew describes as a Canaanite. And the Canaanites were the worst of Israel's enemies in the Old Testament. Now, the Gentiles aren't a part of the program currently. I mean, there's a place for the Gentiles in Jesus' plan, but it's not yet. But this woman, this Gentile woman, comes to Jesus asking for mercy. And if you know anything about Jesus, you know if someone asks for mercy, whether they're a part of the program or not, he's going to give it to them. At first he says, well, it's not right to take the bread that belongs to the children and give it to their dogs. And this is almost universally misunderstood. People think Jesus is calling this woman a dog. Well, he's not. Jesus would never call a person a dog.
he's making a parable. He's drawing an illustration from her world. Because Jews don't keep dogs. Dogs are seen as unclean. Gentiles do. Gentiles have little dogs in the house, pets. And that's the image that Jesus is drawing on. It's not right to take bread and throw it to the puppies, he says. Well, she engages Jesus' image. He says, well, Lord, it's okay if the puppies catch the crumbs that fall from the table. And Jesus is delighted, I think, by the response of this woman. He's delighted by her persistence. He's been trying to teach his disciples to be persistent for 3 years. So her request is granted, and the girl is healed. But that happens off stage. The point of the story is not the healing of the little girl. The miracle of the story is the faith of this Gentile woman.
In all of the accounts, Peter's confession comes before the Transfiguration. It's very important. The Transfiguration is not proof. Jesus doesn't do proof. The end of the ministry is approaching, and Jesus is undeceiving his disciples. They don't understand what Messiah means. So Peter makes the confession, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, and now Jesus begins to teach them what that means. They go up on the mountain. He takes the three, Peter, James, and John, his core, and in their presence he becomes luminous. They get to see his true nature. And if you're going to really engage with this story, you have to understand that the context is fear. They are terrified. Peter says, Master, is it good for us to be here? Peter remembers his Old Testament. He knows that it's not good to be on top of a mountain with beings who are luminous. This kind of light can be very dangerous in the Old Testament. He volunteers to make 3 shelters. In the Gospel of Mark tells us that Peter didn't know what he was saying, so what he said was almost certainly the wrong thing to say. But at that point, God provides a cloud. And the cloud protects them. The cloud covers them. But very important, from the cloud comes the voice of God. He repeats the 2 things he said way back at the baptism. This is my beloved Son, and I'm delighted in him. But then he adds a new piece of information. He says, listen to him. There's an urgency. The time is growing short. They've got to get this. And so to the 3 who are so terrified in the presence of Jesus and Moses and Elijah, who are all so luminous, God urges these 3 men to listen to his Son. That's his identity, the beloved Son that God is delighted in, who needs to be listened to.
On the way down the mountain, once more Jesus commands their silence. It is not that he's keeping his messiahship a secret, only that he knows he must first teach them what it means to be the Messiah. This he will try to do during their final 10-day to 2-week walk back down the Jordan Valley and up to Jerusalem, where the cross is waiting for him.
Chapter 18 in Matthew is the calm before the storm. In 19, they'll leave this place, make their way down the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem and the cross that's waiting there for Jesus. So 18 is their last chance to hang out together in a familiar place, in Peter's house. Now Jesus had been talking so much about the kingdom, the disciples ask him a sensible question: who's the greatest in the kingdom? From the very beginning, Jesus has presented it as an upside-down kingdom. In order to be rich, you let go of your wealth. In order to be wise, you embrace foolishness. And in order to be really mature, in order to be the greatest, you become a child. So he takes a child, I think it's probably one of Peter's children, he puts him in the midst of the disciples and points to the child. This is the example. This person is the greatest in the kingdom. Because a child knows they have nothing to promote themselves by. They're willing to ask for what they know they don't deserve, which is vital if you're going to be a part of Jesus' kingdom. Jesus aligns himself. He identifies himself with children. And because of that, children bear a concealed dignity in the kingdom, in the upside down kingdom of Jesus. During their final time together here in Capernaum, they've been talking a lot about forgiveness. You can almost hear the wheels turning in Peter's mind. So at one point he turns to Jesus and says, well, how many times must I forgive my brother? 7 times? Now for Peter, that's a pretty generous number. Jesus responds, no, not 7 times, 70 times 7. Now, that's an emotional number. Jesus isn't saying we should forgive our brother 490 times. Numbers have an emotional value in Semitic thought. And so Jesus is saying, you forgive your brother more times than you could possibly imagine. And this is an important idea. And so Jesus will illustrate with a parable. There are 2 slaves. One slave owes his master 10,000 talents. Now that number has an emotional value. This is 60 million days' work. It's a debt he'll never be able to repay. The king calls him in and he falls down on his knees and he begs for more time to pay the debt off, this debt that he could never repay. And the king, in an incredible act of mercy, in an act of hesed, forgives, cancels the debt. So the slave is free. That same slave, in Jesus' parable, then finds one of his fellow slaves who owes him a very small amount, the equivalent of 100 days' work. And he strangles him and he throws him in prison, and he doesn't show mercy to his fellow slave. Whenever you're shown mercy in the Bible, the expectation is always that you'll reciprocate. You always show hesed if you've been shown hesed. Well, the king finds out about it, and boy, is he angry. He finds that slave that he had forgiven the great debt, and he throws him in prison, he castigates him, and he has a horrible punishment. And Jesus leaves Peter to think about this parable. He leaves it open-ended so Peter will have to engage with his imagination, because without realizing it, Peter, by volunteering this small amount of 7 times forgiveness, in a way, Peter was being like the unforgiving slave in Jesus' parable.
In chapter 19, Jesus begins to move in the direction of Jerusalem. The formal journey begins in chapter 20, verse 17. If we remain sensitive to the flow of the ministry, from this point on, Jesus is on his way to the cross. As he leaves Galilee, I wonder if he pondered that when he returned, he would be resurrected from the dead, and his work would finally be done.
Chapter 19, they leave this place for good, and they make their way to Jerusalem. Along the way, the Pharisees ask Jesus some trick questions. A trick question is an insincere question. They don't really want an answer. They want an excuse or reason to blame or to charge Jesus for being unorthodox or giving the wrong answer. One of the most hotly debated topics is divorce. And in rabbinics, at this point, there are 2 schools. There's Shammai, who's pretty severe, and he says the only reason for divorce is marital unfaithfulness, adultery. And then there's Hillel, who is usually a pretty gentle, reasonable rabbi, but Hillel's answer to the question is a man can divorce his wife for any reason, even if he doesn't like the meal she prepares for him. Jesus almost always sides with Hillel, but this is the one time on the issue of divorce that he sides with Shammai. Only for marital unfaithfulness will Jesus say a person can be divorced. But Jesus isn't drawn into the debate. Instead, and I really love this about him, he talks about what marriage is all about. He talks about the fact that God made them man and woman, Ish and Isha in Hebrew. They fit together, their names, man and woman, fit together. He talks about oneness, what God has put together, man can't separate. The two become one, he says. So he has a little discourse there on the unity of marriage. And that's where the discussion ends. What I find fascinating, however, is the very next scene in Matthew. We see Jesus holding children in his arms. And I think it's important to realize that after this discussion about divorce, the first thing Jesus does is find some children who are always the victims of divorce. He puts his hands on them and he holds them. And sometimes I wonder if he wanted to hold them as much as they wanted to be held by him. The final stop on the road to Jerusalem, before Jerusalem, is Jericho, the oldest city in the world. It's a 15-mile walk straight up the hill to Jerusalem from there. Now, Luke tells us that when Jesus enters Jericho, he meets Zacchaeus, the little con man who's up in the tree. But Mark tells us on the way out, he meets one blind man. Mark knows his name. His name is Bartimaeus. And Mark, he makes a lot of the story of Bartimaeus. It's very important. Matthew doesn't make as much of the story of the blind man in Jericho. In fact, Matthew doubles his witnesses. He always does that. Matthew tells us there are two blind men as Jesus is leaving the city. They cry out, he's the son of David, and they ask for mercy. They're brought to Jesus, and he asks them a very politically incorrect question. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Sort of puzzling. But Jesus wants them to articulate their need. And so they respond, "We want to see." Jesus merely touches them, and their physical eyes are open. But I believe their spiritual eyes are also open. You know why? They immediately turn and follow Jesus all the way to Jerusalem. All of the Gospels speak to us of the triumphal entry of Jesus coming into Jerusalem for that first day of Passion Week. But only Matthew explains this coming in terms of a prophecy. You know, Matthew loves to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. It's Zechariah 9:9, which speaks of a gentle king coming on the foal of a donkey. Two key words, king, first of all, because Jesus is coming as a king, but also gentle, very important. Now 30 years ago when Jesus came, Matthew tells us the city was troubled. Now he tells us the city is stirred, because the way a king enters a city, the type of horse he's riding on when he enters the city makes all the difference in the world. If Jesus were riding a war horse, the city would be in big trouble because he'd be coming in judgment. And in Revelation 6, that's exactly what we see, Jesus on a white war horse. But Zechariah tells us he's coming on the foal of a donkey, and it's a gentle king. He hasn't come to conquer, though he is a victorious king. He hasn't come to conquer. He's come to be conquered on that cross, because that is how he wins the victory.